this father of the faithful. This whole plan of redemptive plan is based on whether you're going to have faith in a spirit God that you can't see versus laws and rules and things cast in stone that you can, or idols that start getting made out of stone, or this type of thing. The other thing that you're going to see too is that these guys made a lot of mistakes. Because even though they listened to God, they didn't wait for everything that God had to say. God told Abraham in Genesis 15 very early on, he said, what can I do for you? And Abraham says, I don't have an heir. He said, well, you're going to have an heir. And your family is going to be as numerous as the stars. It's not going to come from from Damascus. You're going to have an heir. And then at 86, Abraham was 86 when he bore Ishmael through Hagar. It wasn't until he was 99 that God told him that he was going to have a son by Sarah. And that's and he's going to name him Isaac, and that's who his promise was going to come through. That's where his offspring is going to be named. If he had waited, instead of taking things into his own hands and saying, oh, well, God said I was going to have an heir, so I guess I got to make it come true. We would have gotten a lot less messed up. But I'm starting to get ahead of myself. So, God's promise to Abraham was not to be displeased with Sarah telling him to take Hagar off. Do what she says, because the slave woman, whatever Sarah says for you to do as she tells you, because it's through Isaac that your offspring is going to be named. Abraham really wanted it to be Ishmael. But God said, no, through Isaac, So now we have Isaac. And we have that story of the things of Isaac growing up and then the sending off of Ishmael. And when Hagar and Ishmael fled from Sarah, the angel of the Lord came to them, and they would die. They would ran out of water or food or whatever, and so they were sitting under two different bushes, and the Lord said that he's going to take care of Ishmael, that his offspring would be an unnumbered multitude too, that 12 princes would come from him. And so God was looking out after Ishmael too. But the covenant that God is going to make, the family that God is going to start here, that are going to be his people, are going to come through Isaac. Sarah dies. Isaac's 40 years old when he marries Rebekah. Abraham sent one of his, if you remember, he sent one of his servants, said, don't get him a wife from the Egyptians or from the Canaanites. Don't get him a wife from around here. Go back to my people and get him a wife from back there on the other side of the Euphrates, Padan or Aram. I keep on. It sounds like Iran or an Iraq. But it's that area. So, but she's barren. For 20 years, she's barren. And so Isaac prays to God because she was barren. Isaac prays to the Lord, and the Lord grants his prayer. Isaac is 60 now, and he prays for Rebekah, and then she conceives. But she starts having all kinds of problems with this birth, so she inquires of the Lord. And the Lord says there's 2 nations in your womb. 2 people from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, shall serve the younger. Later on, we learn in Romans, God said, it's Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. God's plan versus Isaac's plan. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, and Esau was a big hunter and outdoor type of guy. He was a man's man. Jacob lived in tents, it says. Kind of gives you the impression that he was just a little bit lazy, or maybe he was more of a mama's boy. But Rebekah loved Jacob. To sojourn in this land. Don't go down to Egypt. Sojourn in this land for you, and because I'm going to give this to you and your offspring. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham, your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and give them all these lands, and your offspring shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charges, my commandments, and my statutes, and my laws. So he's saying this to Isaac, so that Isaac will obey his commandments, his statutes, and his laws too. But he didn't hear what God had said to Rebekah. Apparently they didn't share that with each other, because when it came time for Isaac to be old, he told Esau, I'm old, I don't know when I'm going to die, so go prepare me some delicious food such as I love and bring it to me, so that I may eat and that my soul may bless you before I die. So Isaac has chosen Esau to extend his blessing to.
Ron,
Yes.
and he was doing this in spite of that patriarchal law. Because when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, being the older child, he sold that birthright. It gave Jacob the right to the blessing. And Abraham was ignoring that.
Yeah, and maybe Isaac knew that, and maybe he didn't. We're not really told whether he knew that, but it seemed as though that this was Isaac's plan, that he wanted to bless Esau. Because even though he couldn't see who it was, he knew what the two were different. So he knew he was trying. He knew, we can see in the process that he knew he was trying to bless Esau. But Rebekah had heard this going on. She knew what God had told her. So now she puts her little plan into action. As we read this about this family getting started and how it starts, we all have, I guess, things in our family tree that if we shake it hard enough, nuts fall out. But this just shows you, this is just human nature. This is how families have been from the very beginning. that, we're not unique in the things that we go through, but we're also, we have this tendency to try to run ahead of what God has said. We're taking what God has said and then go do our own thing with it. This kind of a pattern is starting to emerge from Noah and Abraham to now to Isaac.
A pattern of the women, Eve, Sarah, and Rebecca, kind of getting in,
Trying to help God,
trying to help God.
Trying to help God. Yeah, that's
and we're still doing it.
that's an interesting pattern too, that is there. And that's a good observation, that when people say, the women in the Bible were just hated, they were treated as second-class citizens. That's not true. We see that in that type of a pattern where God's promises are just as much dependent upon the women coming through as they are the men. So God talks to them.
If not more.
Yeah, I don't know about the more or not, because we always have them going to be like what happened in the garden. Your desire is going to be different than your husband's. You're always going to, contrary to your husband's, but he's going to rule over you. So from the very beginning there, we see that men were from Mars and women are from Venus, or whichever way that title went, and why? That's why, because that was established early on, and so we always see this friction, this little bit of friction there, this little bit of misunderstanding that we have between the sexes. We just have to let God rule that. I'm sorry.
Men and women think differently.
Exactly. If we thought the same, we wouldn't have needed a helpmeet. But we had Adam lacked something, and so God made Eve so that not only would he be able to procreate, but there was things that Adam didn't have that Eve was gonna. That's just my thoughts on that.
My focus is on God and Him being number one. Your focus is on God being number one. We're gonna come together. We're gonna be a great team.
Yeah, I use that triangle a lot in my teaching, that if you're both focused on the same God, and that relationship, your relationship with that God, if you're both focused on that point, then you're going to naturally come together, because as you both move toward God, closer to God, you're going to draw closer together. If you look at a triangle, the way a triangle is done. But if you move toward your wife or you move toward your husband, you naturally get farther away from God. It's just one of those things that an older man, one of my mentors, told me early on: don't just marry a Christian, marry somebody who's committed to having a relationship with God. Because if she's committed to having a relationship with God, and you're committed to having a relationship with God, your relationship's naturally going to grow closer together as you get older. As you get closer to God, your relationship will get closer to each other.
And he learned that from Scripture.
And he learned that from this right here. God was establishing this family, and so, press too many buttons here. So this is the blessing. It's a little harder to read because it's not as big on the screen as I wanted it to be. But Isaac planned to bless his firstborn Esau. Give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine, people to serve him, nations to bow down to you, Lord over your brothers. Your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. He was passing this down to Esau, he thought. And then Esau actually came in after this blessing, and this was the only thing that he had left. This is the only blessing that he had left, and this was the one that was intended to go to Jacob. Away from the fatness of the earth, your dwelling place, and away from the dew of heaven, and you'll live by the sword, and you'll serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. That was the blessing that was going to go to Jacob. But because of Rebekah's little hoodoo, obey my voice and do this, and Jacob did, we got things switched around. So Esau plans on killing Isaac now, or Jacob, because of stealing. He said he stole my birthright. Well, he didn't steal it. That wasn't exactly true. You gave it away. He just made a pretty good bargain in there and said, you know what, give me your birthright and I'll give you some stew. And Esau despised his birthright enough that he let that happen. Don't let good things get away from you because you're hungry, because you're suffering or something like that. It's Romans 8, 30, 31 in there, where it talks about nobody can steal your salvation from you. But there's been people that have gave it up for some, what we would look at and say some very silly reasons, some very sad reasons that they just decided, I'm in love with that guy's wife more than I am with my wife, and so it doesn't matter that I've been a preacher for 40 years, that's what I'm going to do. I like that house better than I like my other house, so I'm going to embezzle the money to buy this house because it's in some place that I really want to live. And they make bad decisions and give away their birthright because of the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, or the pride of life. How many politicians have sold out for re-election? How many people have become CEOs and sacrificed their family at the altar of business? You have your hand up?
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, with this speaking, you're going to concerning Esau and Jacob. All that was predestined, was it not? God had already told him. So it was predestined.
Well, there's a difference between, but there's choice was still theirs to make. I mean, if Jacob decided he wasn't going to listen to what Rebekah told him and said, I'm not going to deceive my father, then he would have blessed Esau. God's foreknowledge, we know that these things were going to happen, but he didn't make it happen of deceiving one or the other, or making one choose one over the other. That's just things that we do. That's the hard part of predestination, foreknowledge, God's end of the stick to whittle on, that we don't always seem to understand. We have explanations for it, but sometimes they seem a little bit weak. But we always understand this: God knows everything that's going to go on. He already knows who's in the Lamb's Book of Life. But He also says, if you do this, I'll blot your name out. We already know that Christian is in Ephesians. We were predestined before the foundation of the world, but we still have choice. So how that all interacts and works is God's end of the stick to whittle on. We know that we still have to choose, and we can choose. We see enough people making choices and wrong choices, even though God can take those wrong choices and make His plan still work.
Yeah, Ron, just to say it, to sum it up, it's, in God's plan of redemption, man's decisions are within that, because He knows what's gonna happen. So our wrong decisions, our right decisions are included in God's redemptive plan. There you go.
And the thing to do is to stay on God's side, so even if you make a wrong decision, as these guys did in a lot of cases, even if you make a wrong decision, there's gonna be, if you stay believing in God, there's gonna be a redemption, there's a possibility of redemption. Oh, yes, Al.
And God allows things to happen, even when it's somebody doing evil, because He can turn around and use it for good. And that's probably the foresight of His mind, seeing where the best thing to allow to happen, for His good. That's what Joseph told his brothers after Jacob died. You meant it for evil, but God used it for good.
Yep, and we're gonna get to that. That's gonna be one of the last things that we see here, is that, and that's always a good thing to remember, that you might have meant it for evil, but God had a good ending in it. God meant it for good. So Jacob now listens to Rebekah. Rebekah says, okay, go away for a while until Esau cools off. So she's going to send him to her brother in Padan Aram. And Isaac realizes that the mistake now that he has made, he's blessed the one and not so blessed the other one, but that's the way things are. He's not going back on the blessing. That's the way that it went down. This is God's will. That's what is going to happen, I guess. Anyway, so he says, okay, yeah, it's a good idea. Bless you, stay safe, get out of here. Neither of them realizing that Laban is just as much of a trickster as Jacob is. So he's about to reap what he's been sowing by going to Rebekah's brother. Jacob leaves and he has this vision. He lays down and puts his head on this rock, and he has this vision of God standing at the head end of a ladder in heaven, and says, this must be the house of God. Names it Bethel. Makes a promise to God that I will always serve you if you'll bring me back here alive. So he goes on his way. He gets to Padan Aram, and we know the story, how he sees Rachel. She's the beautiful one, and he wants to marry her. Laban says, I'll give her to you. What are you going to do for me? And Jacob says, I'll serve you for 7 years for your daughter Rachel. Well, 7 years comes up, and he gives him Leah instead of Rachel. And he's like, hey, what's this? You said you were gonna give me Rebecca. He said, you know, that's the way we do things around here. We give the older first. So if you want Rachel, you're gonna have to serve me for 7 years, like you said. You know, you just served me 7 years, but that wasn't for her. That 7 years is for Leah, because we give the older one first. So Jacob gets tricked into another 7 years. And then over this period of time, they start fighting about whose womb is closed up and who's having sons. And there's kind of this competition between Rachel and Leah. And Jacob doesn't seem to have much to do with it, other than we know he's on the other half of all of this. But they fight back and forth. We have that little scenario going on. And in the process, Jacob is prospering. Laban is prospering because of the Lord's blessing on Jacob. Laban sees this. He says, you know, this guy, I've been doing pretty good since this guy's been here. Now I got 12 grandsons. And I got lots of flocks and everything else. And Jacob sees that he served for 14 years. He's got 12 new mouths to feed, and he's got nothing to show for it. So he makes a deal with Laban to serve him another 6 years, to tend to his flocks another 6 years, and then he can go. Jacob's got something in mind here. I don't know how this works. God only knows how this works. When he would see he said, I'll just take the speckled ones out. I'll just take the rejects out of your flock. Laban says, that's a pretty good deal. You know, I get all the strong ones, you get all the weak ones. Well, then he figured out a way to make the weak ones strong and make them look like rejects, speckled or striped or whatever, and by putting sticks in front of them. Well, I don't think there's any magic in that. I think this is all God's doing. And at the end of 6 years, Jacob's flocks way outnumber Laban's. He's taken everything away from Laban, and now he's got it all. And the girls recognize this. And so when he's ready to go, they're like, well, our father hasn't had anything left for us anyway, so we might as well go along with him. And so they take off to go to Canaan, and Laban chases after him because they stole his idols. Somebody stole his idols. Rachel's the one that stole the idols, isn't she? Leah's eyes were weak, but God chose her to bear the father of the king that would be down the road. And so we get into this thing where we kind of like, I want you to do this. When you read New Testament passages, remember Old Testament stories, or when you read Old Testament stories, remember how that carried over into the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 1:18 and 20 through 25, God talks about his wisdom versus man's wisdom. And how God chose the foolish things and the weak things to make the wise things and the smart things into nothing. He chose preaching to save people. So the foolishness of their preaching is the smart way that God chose for people to be saved. Isaiah had said the same thing. My thoughts are not, that God had said to him, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. My ways are higher than yours. My thoughts are higher than yours. So we always seem to be trying to help God along with our wisdom and our ingenuity. Jacob meets Esau along the way, and he's cooled off. Esau's prospered. He's cooled off. He's got more than enough. And sorry, my hands are really hurting today. He said, I don't need all of your gifts, but that's all well and good. I'll take it. Just follow me down, and we'll have a big feast and we'll have a big party and we'll all get together and things will be good. Jacob still doesn't trust Esau, and God told him to go back to Canaan. Didn't tell him to go down to Edom. So Jacob wrestles with the angel, gets his name changed to Israel, wrestles with this angel, and then goes to Canaan instead of following Esau. Raises his 12 sons in Canaan. We see some problems. We see a lot of problems. We see a lot of how pretty much he had one weak son, 10 hellions, and one son that was his favorite that seemed to be, that's absorbed everything from him about God. Joseph is his favorite. Joseph listens to him tell him about God. Joseph listens to him tell him about how God has saved him through his whole life. Joseph gets sold by his brothers to the Midianites and sent down to Egypt. And then we have that story begin to happen. And nobody seems to remember this promise to Abraham. Somehow that didn't get passed down. Your people are gonna get enslaved in a country for 400 years and serve this other country. And then when they come out, then I'm gonna punish that country for enslaving. It shouldn't have never gone down to Egypt, but they did. They went down to Egypt 70 persons, and later Moses would remind them, your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons. And now the Lord your God has brought you out and made you as numerous as the stars of the heavens. Deuteronomy 10:22. So God's promises have taken place through this whole scenario of all of these families being formed, but God has his special family that he's going to bring about in spite of all of their interference and all of their help that they had. And now we have Joseph telling his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I went back through the story of Joseph. Go back through there and read that. I may have missed something. God didn't promise anything to Joseph. Joseph served God his whole life through that without any promises. He didn't promise to make him a great nation. He didn't promise to give him anything. Joseph realized that the dreams that he was interpreting, God was the interpreter of those dreams. He realized that everything that he had, his talent and whatever, and was from God. He probably didn't understand how he kept ending up in jail, but he must have believed that God had some kind of a plan for him, because I can't find any, and maybe God did talk to him and tell him, but it's not recorded. I couldn't find any promises that God made to Joseph. Anywhere in that story that God said, stick it out, I got plans for you and they're for good.
The only thing that you might go to that would be back when he was still with his brothers and with Jacob, when he about the time he was 17, where he had those two dreams that showed his brothers bowing down to him, and even Jacob bowing down to him. That's the only thing that you could say.
He seemed to be an interpreter of dreams from early on.
Right,
But,
so
yeah.
in that point, because Jacob even made the point when he told him the dream that the sun and the moon and the 11 stars would bow down to him. I and your mother will serve you and bow down to you. You know, that's the point. Jacob realized he was in the dream as the son. So it may be that Joseph claimed to that, saying, well, God gave me this dream, and if God gave it to me, it's going to come true, and so I just got to keep serving whatever happens. That's the only thing that we can allude to that.
That's what's amazing about Joseph. That's just one of the things that's an amazing story in his life. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of the other brothers. If there had been any passing down of any blessing, he would have got it, but he's presumed dead. Once they get down and they do find each other and they get reunited, and he's about to die, he's leaning on his staff, and he gives a blessing to each of the 12. His blessings for Joseph go to Manasseh and Ephraim, not to Joseph. But this is what he tells to Judah. This is his blessing to Judah. And verse 10 is the most important part of that. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. He's talking, that's a messianic prophecy. He's talking about Jesus. But the blessing went to Judah. And so we see at the end that every single choice that these guys made was wrong. Abraham chose Ishmael to pass the blessing on to. God said no, it's going through Isaac. Isaac chose Esau to go for his blessing to go to. God said no, it's going through Jacob. Jacob's favorite was Joseph. His blessing would have gone to Joseph. God said no, it's going through Judah. That's where the king comes from. So we see that in a lot of times, even though they were serving God, they only listened to what they wanted to hear, and then they tried to finish it on their own. That reminds me of another thing that Paul said in the New Testament, in Galatians. You foolish Galatians, you started with the Spirit, now you're trying to finish it in the flesh. There's other patterns that are emerging here too, and we see this with the barren women. We also see it with the age of Abraham. This death, burial, and resurrection. Each time he starts over, whether it's with Noah, Seth, Abraham, they're almost dead, and he starts this plan over again. There's always a remnant. We learn that later on. There's always a remnant. Every time something goes wrong and it looks like this plan is going to fail, there's always a remnant. Judah did some horrible things. We have little stories about Judah while they were in Canaan, before they went down to Egypt. Judah did some horrible things. But that's where the plan was going through. That's where the promise was going through. So God's promises never fail, even though man constantly tries to fulfill those promises on his own strength. And that things like that just remind me that I need to constantly rely back on God. I need to constantly be reminded of everything that he said, not just the part that I wanted to hear. That heaven is mine, and I can get there whether I obey him or not. Or I can live however I want to, because once I've been baptized, I'm in God's family and there's no getting me out of there. And all the heresies all started with the truth, but they, somewhere along the line, the pride of life, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, got them sidetracked, and they wanted to finish God's plan the way that they wanted the ending to come out. And it doesn't take very long of reading Revelation that we can see that it just doesn't work. The big picture of Revelation is the good guys win. What side do you want to be on? That's all I have. That's the class.